The hour of 3 o'clock having arrived, we'll call the meeting of the Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee to order. First item is Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, public comment. Nope, has anybody approached? Nobody's approached either of us. Does anybody wish to make a public comment? If not, we will move on to the approval of the minutes from the October 11th and 16th meetings. What are your wishes? They were in the packet. Moved by Supervisor Lemmer to approve. Is there a second? Seconded by Chair Gibbs. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Without objection, I'd like to move to item 7A, presentation from PFM on reserve and debt management policies, because that is material to our discussion relative to the budget. Is there an objection to moving to 7A first? All right, with that, Christie.
Heather Casperson is on too.
All right. I'll start this out. We have a presentation. There was a discussion on county's general obligation debt. And so we have on the line from PFM, who is our financial advisor, Kristen Hansen and Heather Casperson. Sorry, Heather. And they are going to walk us through this. Part of it's going to be a history and also a general education on what general obligation debt is, and then specify it directly for Marathon County. And at that time, then I will move through slides for PFM folks, and we will start with the presentation, and I will start with Kristen Hansen. And also, just to let you know that when the county goes out for debt service and issues debt, your financial advisor is the one that kind of steps you through it. And so they do the work for us that's relative to the debt issues. So they have been with us through the debt issues for 2018 through 2023. And therefore, as part of the service, they will work with us on any questions or anything that is related to those debt service issues, and that's part of the package that we receive. So we do not pay additional fee for this presentation, but it will be really worth it. So I'm excited to let them take it away.
Thank you, Christy. For the record, my name is Kristen Hansen. I am a director at PFM Financial Advisors based in the Milwaukee office, and also with me is Heather Casperson, who works with me on our Milwaukee credits, or our Wisconsin credits. So there is in your handout the PowerPoint, and I understand that I can't see the PowerPoint, so I'm gonna thank you. So page 2 of the PowerPoint shows what the agenda is, and Christy kind of set the groundwork for this, but I'd like to provide a background about bond basics and talk specifically about general obligation bonds and notes, because that is the type of debt that the county has typically issued historically. Then get a history of the county's borrowings and for what purposes that you have borrowed, and then talk about what options are available for the repayment of the North Central Healthcare Center debt that was issued for the campus project, and then just kind of set the stage for your discussion later in the meeting about kind of next steps. And basically what is, as you as elected officials are the decision makers, and obviously people at the table bring different philosophies on how things should be handled. And so hopefully this will provide some context and details to help you with those discussions and decision making as you go forward. So slide 3 is just the transition slide for bond basics. So slide 4, please. So what is a bond? And I'm going to talk about both bonds and notes because that's what you have been able to issue and have issued in the past when it comes to general obligations. But in its simplest terms, it's a loan between an issuer, you, the county, and an investor, which could be a bank or an underwriter. And bonds are typically referred to as fixed income securities. We're talking about fixed rate. We're not talking about any kind of unique financings. We're not talking about variable rate debt, but these are fixed rate, fixed income securities. And they're used by governments, cities, counties, authorities, school districts, states, and other entities that have the legal authority to borrow to finance capital projects. So they are similar to a home mortgage where, you know, they can be long-term, they can be fixed or variable rate, but in the case of the county, you issue fixed rate debt. There are principal and interest payments, and when you enter into the borrowing, your borrowing costs are paid at closing or settlement, similar to a mortgage. Some of the differences than a home mortgage is the type of lender. So the entities that are loaning governmental entities, the county, money for your capital projects come from banks or financial institutions, underwriting firms, and they're the ones that bid on your bonds and notes, and they are either buying those bonds or notes to keep in their own portfolios, or they have different types of investors that they want, that they are going to sell those bonds or notes to. The repayment schedule is typically, interest is paid twice a year, semi-annually, and principal is paid once a year. So different than a home mortgage where we pay monthly and we pay principal and interest. This is how bonds get repaid. And then once the county, in their case, makes the payments, those debt payments are distributed to the investors that are holding your bonds or notes. The security or the collateral for back, and I apologize for the dog, he's protecting me from trucks, is either the issuer's full faith and credit, which I will talk about in more detail, or a revenue pledge where you have specific revenues coming in to make those payments. The tax status of government bonds is typically tax exempt, which results in a lower interest rate, but depending on the circumstances of what's being financed, you will note that some local governments issue debt on a taxable basis. So there's three types of municipal bonds. I'm going to focus mostly on the first one because this is the type of debt that the county issues. So those are general obligation bonds or notes, which is a common type of municipal bond, and I have this underlined and bolded, which is backed by the quote, full faith and credit of the issuer, and the issuer's promise to make levies to make the payment. So basically, when you issue any kind of general obligation debt, you are pledging your taxing powers to make those debt payments. In some cases, there's an additional revenues that are helping to make those payments, which is what we'll talk about later in the presentation with what your debt has financed. So this is kind of what the focus is. You are making a pledge to, you know, levy your taxpayers to make these bond payments. With revenue bonds, those are financed with revenues that are, you know, from a project that's generating revenue. So you'll see like cities and villages issuing sewer revenue bonds or water revenue bonds, and those bonds are paid for by the revenues that they collect for, you know, sewer fees and water fees. So those would be the example of a revenue bond. Appropriation bonds are a little less common, and so I'm not even going to get into those because we're going to talk, since all your debt is general obligation debt, that's what we're going to talk about. Next slide. So in Wisconsin, statute allows governments to issue what's called general obligation notes, and they must legally mature within 10 years. So between the time you sell the debt and the interest clock starts ticking, they must mature within 10 years. They can be issued for any public purpose, including but not limited to paying any general or current municipal expense and refunding any municipal obligations, including interest on them. But for a public capital purpose. They're commonly used. It's a relatively straightforward issuance process. This is the process the county has used through the years to issue its debt. They have wide market appeal. And the benefit of issuing general obligation notes is that it's easy to reallocate proceeds between projects. There's a whole kind of process of passing an initial resolution that talks about what the projects are going to be financed by the debt that's going to be issued. If you issue general obligation notes, there's flexibility in moving the proceeds around to finance kind of qualified expenditures. The next slide, slide 7, is general obligation bonds. They must mature within 20 years, and there are exceptions in the state constitution, but they can only be used for specific purposes, public purposes, streets, libraries, new money bonds that are, over 10 years in length, less than 20 years, must be issued competitively, which is how you've been selling your debt historically. And if you are refunding your bonds or notes, they can be issued either competitively or with a negotiated sale. And the county has typically issued its GO bonds and notes to finance its capital improvement projects. Christy, is there anything you want to add at this point? Are you there?
Not at this point, but maybe after we go through the
Okay.
presentation, there may be some additional questions about other types of borrowing.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about kind of the history of the county's borrowing and its payback. So historically, the county has borrowed for various types of projects. You borrowed for your capital improvement plans, which has been some of your recent borrowing. You have issued debt to finance the airport projects, and this is an arrangement you have with Portage County. And then you more recently have issued a number of debt issues to finance the North County Healthcare Center project that's located on that campus. All of the debt, and I kind of stated before, that the county has issued has been general obligation debt where the county has pledged its full faith and credit and taxing power. For your capital bonds and notes issued for your capital improvement plans, the county has levied taxes to make those debt service payments. For the airport bonds, those have been paid for, even though they're general obligation, they are paid for by revenues that are generated by the airport. And then for the North County Healthcare Center, when that project started and debt started to be issued, that financing and the structure of the debt was based on indications from the healthcare center that the bonds would be paid for by revenues generated by the healthcare center.
Kristen, at this point, what I did want to let everybody know that we didn't include in here is that the county can issue general obligation debt. What we call the discretely presented component units, which are government entities of which Marathon County has a majority decision-making on a board or has a majority of its financial resources. That includes the healthcare center, the airport, and special education, or the Handicapped Children's Education Board is its formal name. They cannot issue debt on their own, and therefore that is why the Marathon County would take out the debt for the airport, for the healthcare center, because they have that relationship with them, but on their own are not able to levy tax directly or issue debt directly. So I just wanted to bring that up so that you understand why they would be issued by Marathon County and not by the entity itself.
Thank you. So the next slide, slide 10. This shows all of the outstanding debt that the county currently has. And you can see that the airport bonds were issued in 2012 and 2015. And this basically shows what the original principal or par amount of the debt was the outstanding maturities remaining, what the coupons or interest rates are remaining on the outstanding maturities, and then the principal currently outstanding. And then I created that far right column that shows what the debt was issued for. So then in 2019 through 2022, notes and bonds were issued to finance the county's capital improvement projects as well as the healthcare center project. So you can see what the original principal amount was, the outstanding maturities, the coupons outstanding, and how much principal is outstanding. You can see that the interest rates, depending on when the county came into the market, range from 1% to 4%. Interest rates have been going up. And so at this point in time, for any bonds, you know, people always talk about, oh, we've refunded bonds or things like that. When we sell bonds, we set what's called a call feature or a redemption feature, which determines which maturities could be refinanced and at what point in time. And so a couple of things here. Most bonds have 10-year calls, so the call dates on any of the bonds that are outstanding would not be callable until the earliest would be 2030. And even if they were callable, interest rates are at a level that are higher than what you're currently paying. And so even if you could refinance them, it would not generate any savings for the county.
Kristen, at that part.
And some of the earlier,
Oh, go ahead, and I have
some
one
of the
other.
earlier notes that were issued, there was a portion of those notes that did include part financing for the healthcare center. And then as the issues got larger, we separated it out for tracking purposes and sold them as separate debt issuances.
Two things that I did want to mention on this. You can see that the outstanding coupons, you can actually see the impact of rising interest rates in a borrowing market. So we're fixed income because we have generating a standard interest and a principal payment. But you can see back in 2018 and 2020, you're going to have interest rates of 1% to 2% on the money that you borrowed. And as we went through and borrowed for each portion of the either the county CIP or the healthcare center, those rates did increase, but our last one was with an outstanding coupon of 3% to 4%, and now interest rates are higher. One of the things you do want to know is that the rates that we receive on competitive bid have been pretty decent in the times of which we borrowed. We can compare what we are getting on those GO bonds or GO notes to other sales within our kind of municipal market. Secondly, one of the reasons that our rates are so low is because we are a AA1 rated county. AAA is the highest rating you can get, and we economically and by size would not be able to meet that criteria, that level. Someone like Waukesha County would be an example of a AAA rated county in Wisconsin. So it's probably we aspire to be at the highest rating we can, and AA1 fits in the formula for us. The impact you see on this chart is that it will produce lower interest rates than other municipalities that may go to market with a lower credit rating. So that is important for us to maintain and to have you understand that does benefit the county when we do go to market. And thanks for letting me interject. Kristen, I'll let you continue.
And just kind of where the market is, we sold some notes, GO notes for Milwaukee County last week. And that interest rate for only 10-year paper was over 4%. And they're a AA2. So their credit rating isn't quite as high, and markets have gone up. Next slide just gives you a context, and I am my own quality control, so there's a bonus G in remaining. So the legal debt limit of the county, so debt limit in the state of Wisconsin is equal to 5% of the equalized value of the county, or whoever the governmental entity is. And so you can see your legal debt limit is almost 800 million, 795,568. We're using your 2023 equalized value. You have just under 100 million in outstanding GO debt, which is you're only using 12.5% of your debt limit or your debt capacity. Entities always want to know kind of where are we in our debt limit. And so this is just to give you a picture of, you could issue, more, but you are well within the debt limit, the legal statutory debt limit as defined in Wisconsin law. So starting kind of back on the financing of the master facility plan for the North Central Healthcare Center. Back in 2018, in early 2018, at that time, the county board approved the concept to go forward with the North Central Healthcare proposed $67 million master facility plan. This was presented to the county board by the healthcare center and their consultants. And the board adopted what's called an initial resolution, which needed to be passed by 3/4 of the board members, which state, to finance the full $67 million. So on June 19th of 2018, once the board had approved the concept to go forward with the project, the board adopted a resolution, and I've included kind of the title of the resolution, which had been prepared by the county's bond counsel, Quarles and Brady, which authorizes the issuance of general obligation debt. So at that time, that resolution stated, initial resolution authorizing not to exceed $67 million general obligation bonds or notes for the North Central Healthcare Master Facility Plan project. So that happened back in June of 2018, so over 5 years ago. Next slide.
Before we get to the slide, it does say PFM on the bottom, but this cash flow analysis was provided by the North Central Healthcare executive team in cooperation with their paid consultant, not PFM, but it's in her slide presentation, so we just want to make that clear.
Because we have to use our template. So I pulled this, the income available for debt service. This was pulled from that master plan. So that information was initially provided back in April of 2018. That was the date on the presentation that shows for 20 years how much income would be available for debt service for the healthcare center and the other project. And so you can see that the healthcare center was looking at that they were going to generate over $70 million of income available for debt service. So that was kind of what set the stage for the borrowing. And Christy, I don't know if you want to, obviously there's a full presentation that was provided to the county board. This is just one page out of it. I don't know if you want to add anything else here.
Not at this time, just that this was what was provided by the healthcare center and their consultant for estimating the ability for them to pay back the debt at that time.
So as projects happen, obviously they don't all get built all at once. And because of the size of the project, $67 million, it was a phased project. And so this next slide shows that the bonds were issued over time. You obviously don't want to issue all the bonds all at once. There's other kind of tax implications, spend down implications and things like that. And you don't want to be paying for debt on a project that hasn't been built yet. So bonds and notes were brought to market over time as they were needed for the various phases for the projects. And so you can see that the 2019A promissory notes that were issued financed both a portion or paid for the capital improvement projects for the county, but it also financed the central utility plant at the healthcare center. So $2,445,000 of the notes was used for that piece. In 2020, the county issued $8.5 million in GO promissory notes. $5,330,000 of the notes were used to finance the master plan projects at that time. You can see the youth hospital, some contingencies, and some adult facilities. In 2020, the county issued just under 18 million to finance the next phases of the project. In 2021, 19 million was issued to finance, the continued phases, and then the last issue was done in 2022 and 19,225,000. So 63,845,000 was issued of the authorized 67 million. So I said 63,485,000. You can see that there's a remaining authorization of 3,155,000. However, initial resolutions, which the resolution was passed in 2018, has kind of a limit of 5 years. So at this point in time, you have issued all the bonds you can for the project based on rules regarding financing and issuing debt. So earlier this year, the county was informed that there would not be enough funds to make their entire kind of annual debt service payment. And so the county and the healthcare center entered into an amended agreement for a new repayment schedule for them to pay back their debt. And that was entered into in March of 2023. The following slide shows that revised payment schedule. And now kind of where you are today as part of your budget process, you're now discussing how best to address making those debt service payments on the debt that's associated with the healthcare center project. And so this payment schedule, you can see, shows how much principal is outstanding. This is the revised schedule that was agreed upon in the agreement that was signed in March of 2023. You can see in the earlier years, highlighted in green, the total payments are not as high, and then they kind of ramp up as it goes forward, with the thought that, as the project was being built, some of the revenues would not be as high until it was fully occupied and various revenue sources to support the debt payment would come in. And so this is kind of the payback schedule that the county has between the healthcare center. And so kind of, now you're at a point kind of as you look to, the debt is outstanding for the project is constructed, and for us to be able to provide you detailed options on kind of what you have available, and I've highlighted them generally here, is that the county needs to review the cash flows to determine how much money is available to make its debt service payments. That is the number that should be driving discussions. Because, what is the gap that, needs to be made kind of going forward. And, there are various options that exist. And it sounds like you've had some preliminary discussions at the committee level and the county board level about how you address any kind of shortfalls as determined by the cash flow projections. Obviously, because the debt is general obligation debt, you can pay for it with a debt levy. Obviously, there's pros and cons with that. Obviously, that increases, the mill rate for the county. You could pay for it with existing reserves that the county has. And, the rating, Christy mentioned the rating. The county has a AA1 rating, which is the second highest rating you can get. Rating agencies do look at the spend down of reserves of governmental entities. It sounds like there's been some discussions about paying for it with a steady revenue source, such as, revenues that you're already collecting, sales tax revenues or miscellaneous revenues, or look at paying for it with a combination of sources. And so we are happy to provide options But before we start structuring or looking at the various options, we really need to know what numbers we're dealing with. And until you have an idea based on the cash flows provided to you by the healthcare center, it's hard to kind of speculate what those numbers are if we don't have them. And so at this point, Christy, I kind of turn it over to you because the last page of the slide is kind of next steps.
Yeah, so right now what we're doing is we're using the cash flow analysis and the agreement, the debt service payments for county debt and the amounts that the North Central Healthcare has designated as debt repayment. And so I think what we can do is try to figure out what that gap will be between the two. If you want to fill it with tax levy, we are putting $3 million of sales tax into our debt service. We have $150,000 miscellaneous revenue, which is generally your investment income, which is higher than it was for 2023's budget, and that's because we're in a better, even though the cost of borrowing for us is higher, the cost of investing, the rate of income returns for investing is higher. So we've estimated $150,000 instead of $100,000. But what I think PFM would help do is, if you want to determine what we need to do to make that gap up between the two amounts, or what we're comfortable with going forward for debt service, that's where we really would be able to develop the policy. Currently, reserves would roll to CIP. The sales tax has been generating enough income and going up every year, so $3 million is a reasonably conservative number to put in there. $13 million is in the general fund. So that's, I think, where the next steps would need to be, is what is the board finance committee feel is appropriate so that we can service debt and that we've managed all of those options available to us in a manner that we can have reasonable assurance that we're comfortable with those items. So that's what the presentation is. Kristen, I know that there's some questions in regards to a potential conduit bond borrowing. Would you be able to answer those questions if they would arise? Not to put you on the spot.
Is this about the digester project?
Yes, heads are shaking yes as well. So we'd finish off with this,
I
but
can't see.
if she's available, we can definitely, she has been in discussions and knows somewhat about that too. So I guess I would leave it up to you guys for.
Administrator Leonard.
Hey, Kristen, this is Lance. If you could, in some of your slides, you talked about the counties, Marathon County's history relative to the issuance of debt. Can you perhaps, just for context for the board members, kind of explain how our use of debt, and this is going to be my characterization, but the fact that we go out kind of as on an as-needed basis when we have a large battery of projects or a particularly large project, can you contrast that with perhaps some of your other clients that you have in the state of Wisconsin, just to demonstrate some of the different strategies that counties utilize relative to the taking on of debt and debt management for projects within their counties?
Yes. So we work with a neighboring county to you, and they typically do their borrowing for highway projects, and they do not borrow on an annual basis. We work with a county that is a county or two north of the Illinois border, and in fact, they do annual borrowing for their CIP projects every year, and they incorporate their borrowing into their budget process. I mean, their finance committee just adopted their essentially their initial resolutions last week, and we'll have the second reading next week with the county board to do their 2024 capital improvement projects. Milwaukee County, they do annual borrowing and for their capital projects, and then as needed, they issue bonds for their Milwaukee airport, and so those bonds get issued on a, more on an as needed basis, and they actually negotiate those bonds. So, and then as, if you go back to the master facility, this started, there was this need, there's counties that there's building needs out there, and, some counties don't do any borrowing for their capital improvement projects. I work with another county, they issued, they built a smaller government services building. It was under 14 million. That happened. Basically, that process started kind of pre-COVID, ended, the building is constructed. Now they're talking about a jail project. So some counties just borrow for big projects. So it really goes to, what the needs are. So there's counties that obviously borrow on a regular basis for capital improvement projects. The county that's, just south of me, I'm in Milwaukee, they have added borrowing for equipment into their annual borrowing so that they didn't have to, tap into their, existing funds on an annual basis to keep up with some of the equipment needs they have, squad cars and things like that. So, it really depends on, your kind of what the needs are, what their philosophy is, what the projects are. And so it's really good to start conversations like this to develop policies and procedures, going forward.
If I can have a follow-up, and thank you, Kristen. That's precisely what I wanted, I think, to convey, is this idea that I think these conversations are good to have, because there are no two counties that do it exactly the same. There are those counties that utilize borrowing every year, and as Kristen said, they develop a budget based upon borrowing for their CIP and issue the debt at the end of that year and pay it off the next year. There are a lot of different ways to approach that. But can you talk a little bit about kind of where we are with respect to the revenues we're receiving from investments? You referenced callable debt before and our ability essentially to prepay, but kind of the analysis of where are we at with our current investment income rates and how those compare to what you're seeing in terms of rates for issuing debt. Sorry to put you on the spot.
So No, this is okay. First of all, we're financial advisors. We have a fiduciary responsibility to you, the county. As I, indicated, we just sold some notes for Milwaukee County last week, and it was a 10-year note. I think they're at AA2, and their true interest cost rate, was 4.13%. So that's literally kind of hot off the press for the county that we're working with that's in the process of passing their initial resolutions for their 2024 borrowing. Because they don't want to borrow until the summer, we're setting, we're estimating rates, over 5% because we just don't know where the market is. Obviously, as interest rates rise, the same thing is happening on the investment side. We're regulated financial advisors. I'm not an investment advisor. Those are different sets of regulations, so I can't talk about those. And I don't know, Heather, have you had kind of recent sales to kind of add on what you're seeing with the market?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Last week, Monday and Tuesday, we had a couple of county sales, and they were 20-year bonds, and the true interest rate percentages were 437, and then the day after it was a 441, and those were just market adjustments from day to day. And similarly, I know that they were locking in their investment rates for those proceeds that are going to be coming in November. And similar to what Kristen was just saying, and again, just also just to reinstate that we, as Kristen mentioned, we are not providing investment advice, but just sharing the information that we are being provided, that investment rates are expected to be, I think, north of 5.4 that they're expected to get on those proceeds. So you have to be very cognizant of investing at a rate higher than what you're borrowing at, so that if you are issuing tax exempt bonds, you are not putting yourself in a position where you are earning what's called positive arbitrage. And so that's something we can maybe save for a later day. Kristen, I don't know if we wanted to start getting into, or Christy, arbitrage rebates, and you can earn higher than where you borrow, so long as you spend the proceeds in an expeditious manner, and there are prescribed percentages and benchmark times at which you need to have the proceeds spent by, so that you can earn that extra amount. But again, we need to be really cautious of that. And when you're in the position of issuing bonds, Kristen and I can go through all those details. Otherwise, let me just say one more thing. Otherwise, if you do earn more than what you borrow at, and you don't spend it fast enough, you will have to rebate that extra interest back to the government if you don't meet those spending benchmarks.
So that raises a question relative to fund balance. As a policy, are you better off understanding that you've got the arbitrage implications associated with the borrowing and investment, but from a financial advisor perspective, are we better off having a higher fund balance for future projects, or how do you look at fund balance impacting our ability to borrow and its impact on rates? I guess there's a couple of questions in there.
There are. So, currently you're a AA1 credit, which is great. And, the rating agencies do look at fund balances. It's part of their criteria in determining what credit rating to assign to an issuer. And so we actually have credit calculator models that we can plug in all of your information into the model it's a proprietary model, to kind of look at what kind of, as you're kind of having this conversation about what our fund balance should be, or if we spend it down, what would the implications be if we spent it down by this, what kind of factor might that have to your bond rating? And so these are things that we would look at for you as you kind of go through the decision-making process of what you want to do regarding the debt. And I am
Kurt?
opening up the credit rating report from 2022. Let's waiting on technology to talk about the things that they look at.
Well, while you're waiting on that, Kristen, this is Kurt Gibbs. So the question I have is, when we borrow funds and bond for a project, the arbitrage is looked at the dollars in the borrowing, is it not? Meaning, so I borrowed $20 million or $19.5 million, and as long as I spend the $19 million on the project and have not received interest effective, I'm going to oversimplify this, and I don't want to get into the whole weeds of the arbitrage rule because it gets very messy, but as I understand it, as long as we don't receive interest on the bond proceeds, interest greater than we're paying, while we're spending that down, we're not in a violation of arbitrage. Is that correct?
Essentially, in simplified terms, yes. So when you were borrowing at, you saw some of those interest rates of 1.25%, and you were investing them at less than, 1%, you weren't earning any, what
Right.
Heather referred to as positive arbitrage. But in this new changing interest rate environment where, investment rates are now,
4 or
in some
5%.
cases higher than what you could borrow at the tax exempt rate, the federal government does not want governments to make money on the tax exemption preferential treatment that governments get for borrowing. So there's rules and exceptions.
But I guess the question that I'm trying to get to or trying to get at is any fund balance that is receiving interest that might be greater than the bond rating is not subject to arbitrage, is it?
So like, are you talking about like the county's general fund?
Correct.
Yeah, that's not subject to arbitrage.
Okay.
No.
Then one other question. When you talked about bonds that are callable, they're only callable, we issue them, and they're only callable after 10 years of issuance. If I heard that correctly, that would mean that there's only two bonds currently that the county has issued that are callable. Those would be the bonds that were issued for the airport with a balance of $1,100,000 at an interest rate of 3 to 3.35%, and then the other bond the following year with a current balance of $2,090,000 with an interest rate of 3 to 3.35. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the airport bonds, not having the official statements in front of me, would have been callable in, probably 2022. The 2015s would have been be callable in 2025. Obviously, interest rates are, somewhat higher than that. The healthcare center building bonds, the 20s, the 21s, and the 22s, callable in 2030, 2031, and 2032. And without getting into any kind of, Heather and I can get into minutia about municipal bonds. We can get into the weeds. We can. As you get close, as you get to the call date, once you get within 90 days of the call date, if interest rates are favorable, you can refinance those like you would refinance a home mortgage. And so, we monitor those for our clients. And as you can see, like the airport bonds have rates that are, 3%, but if you were to refund them, with current market rates,
They
You probably
currently
would
be
see
higher,
this.
right?
yeah.
And we did have conversations with the airport even as of this year yet to take a look at some of those because they have a special ability to use CARES Fund, which we do not. So none of our funds would be able to be used to pay back debt. But I think, Kristen, they determined that wasn't the best use of those funds for them at this time. But they do evaluate those, and we did
Yes.
pay back. We did pay back some bonds for the airport with CARES a while ago too. Yep.
Yeah, a couple of years ago.
So one of the issues before the county board right now is what do we do with the social improvement fund balance? And what has happened over the years is that the fund balance was reserved in excess of what the needs were. And so we went from a 2,945 million dollar fund balance in 17 to basically 14 million in 22. And there are different ideas on how we can do that, what we should do with that. Historically, what we've done with fund balance is rolled it over into our capital improvement program to fund the plan for the year after the completion of the audit. Do you have different, what from a financial planning perspective, what would be the best use? And I don't know that we really know what the appropriate social improvement fund balance would be, but let's assume that there's discretion. Is it more prudent from a financial planning perspective to use that for capital improvement projects going forward, or incorporated it into paying down existing or paying for existing debt or operating expenses?
I mean, I think this actually goes to kind of the decision makers at the county. What is your philosophy? I mean, is your philosophy to be able to pay for, cash for capital improvement projects so you don't have to borrow? Is your philosophy to, keep the levy for debt low, and the debt, the tax burden to your taxpayers low? And so I think kind of from a financial standpoint, you want to look at, if we were to use X number of dollars to to keep the debt levy constant, what does this mean? What is happening to your values? If we were to spend down your fund balance, what might this mean to your rating agency? I mean, and these are these good discussions that you want to have, and and also knowing how much money, if it's the philosophy of the board, the direction of the board to go forward and use monies like that to finance, reduce debt service levy versus paying for projects, kind of what are those trade-offs? And, do you have policies in place to address some of these things? And and if you don't, are those discussions that you want to be having?
Are there other questions that people have of PFM? Lance?
Kristen, this is Lance again. Chair Robinson referenced the digester project, and I apologize if I didn't hear your response. If you want, can you just contrast that conduit issue, how that's different than a general obligation borrowing issue?
Yes. So in the case where the county is issuing general obligation debt, you are the issuer and you are the entity paying back the debt, and the credit rating is based on you, the county. In the case of a conduit borrower, you are issuing the bonds on behalf of another entity, which it sounds like you have this, entity that has come forward and has requested the county to issue industrial revenue bonds to make the payment. In this case, you're issuing the debt on their behalf, but the credit rating is based on the credit of that entity. And because of that, the county's not liable for, it's not going to affect your bond rating. You're not acting as a guarantor to the bonds. So you don't have any liability for the payments. You don't have to do any continuing disclosure, and it's not considered debt of the county. So it's a completely different type of a debt.
Chris, and then just to clarify, that is, the slide you had with our current statutorily allowable debt limit, it would not,
Yes.
the conduit issue would not impact that calculation, correct?
Correct.
Chair Gibbs.
Just to follow up on that, Kristen. So because the other entity is ultimately the responsible party to repay that debt, and you're saying that the county is not ultimately responsible, if the entity were to file bankruptcy in the future or go out of business, and leave the holders of those bonds then high and dry, is there any way that impacts the county's bond rating because they were effectively still the issuance on an industrial revenue bond?
It should not affect the bond rating, but I've been doing public finance for 30 years last week, and I've not seen this happen. And I have actually been an issuer where I've used a conduit borrower. And so, obviously I'd be happy to do, further research. Heather, have you seen any kind of issues with conduit borrowers?
The only example I can think of where something like that, there is an impact, we would call it headline risk, if you do issue bonds on behalf of some sort of development that the development does not ultimately produce the revenues that are required to sustain the bond payments. As Kristen indicated, there's not a direct impact to the county and the county's rating, and investors understand that it's not an obligation of the county, but the risk, when I say headline risk, is just that, that might be an article in the newspaper that discusses the fact that this certain development or whatever the case may be does not produce, and so that, that you have those types of articles that has your name attached to it. But folks do understand that it is not, in fact, Marathon County, and that is sort of the risk. The one thing that you also can end up having with those types of issues is you can charge some sort of administrative fee, and so you can, for the cost of staff time to be involved in those types of issues, you can consider having a fee to compensate for the time and the use of the county's conduit issuance. So there is something that you can consider having that for the use of using the county's borrowing. That makes sense.
It does, thank you.
Other questions for PFM from anyone? If not, thank you for your presentation. We will then move back.
Thank you. And if any questions come up, or as you get some more definition on kind of the needs, and the numbers, we are happy to provide options and analysis and pros and cons on your behalf.
All right. We'll move back then to item 6A, 1, claim disallowance. Mike, is that you?
It is, Mr. Chair. There are 3 separate claims that are listed. I think we need to take each of them separately, so I will start with the first one. It's a claim presented by a Sabrina Sosnowski. The claim was that a shovel came off of a highway department truck and struck her vehicle. Our insurer is recommending that the claim be denied based upon their investigation into the circumstances of the claim. They did not find enough, evidence to support this occurring. So their recommendation is that the county disallow the particular claim.
All right, do you want to deal with we'll deal with these separately? Are there any questions of Corporation Counsel relative to this claim? Are there any questions? If not, what are your wishes, Chair?
I guess the only question, so when we do, and I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So when we get a claim such as this, we hand it over to our insurer, and the insurer does the investigation and then makes the recommendation to the county board. And we feel comfortable that there is no future liability on this. Obviously, the individual, once we deny it, the individual still has a time period to appeal that and bring it back.
That's correct. Our denial or disallowance of a claim simply triggers a time period in which the party can then actually file a claim or a suit against the county. So it doesn't preclude them from pursuing the claim, but it is based upon advice of our insurer, and my office is now involved in assisting them in gathering the information for their investigation, so I do concur with their recommendation.
What are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to deny consistent with the recommendation by our insured
Or Sabrina Sanowski.
for Sabrina Subnowski.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of denial of the claim will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Midwest Wheels.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In this particular claim, Midwest Wheels filed a claim indicating that a sign had fallen in, I believe it was the airport parking lot, and damaged a vehicle that they own. Our insurer was tendered this claim as well. They reviewed the contract language that we have with Midwestern Wheels and found that there's an indemnification and hold harmless contractual provision that would preclude the county from having liability here. So on that basis, they're asking that we disallow the claim, which I think makes sense from a legal perspective.
Are there any questions of Mike relative to this? Any discussion? Or what are your wishes? What are your wishes? That usually looking for a motion. Supervisor Marshall.
Motion to disallow the claim based on recommendation from Corp Counsel.
It's been moved by Supervisor Marshall. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of a denial of the claim will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Gary Steffen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For this final claim, the claim is for damages from scratches on a vehicle that were alleged to have occurred as a result of one of our canine officers scratching the vehicle. The recommendation is for disallowance of the claim because the county actually enjoys discretionary immunity as to the canine officer's acts, and I think that's a proper legal analysis, so I would also recommend disallowance of the claim.
Are there any questions? Are there any questions? If not, what are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to deny the claim by Gary Steffen, consistent with the recommendations.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of denial of the claim will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Do we ever just from a claims management perspective ever look upon these as educational opportunities for our staff? And I know that we have liability protections, but I would hope that our risk managers look at these and from the perspective of, well, we enjoy the protection for the K-9 unit, preventing those from occurring in the future.
Absolutely. Each time something like this occurs, it not only triggers the formal process that you see, but also the educational process with whatever department's involved. That includes our human resources staff. It also includes my staff going over the risk management items. In fact, this morning we had a meeting with the highway department relative to the first claim. So yeah, these are definitely taken as not only times to disallow claims, but also opportunities to avoid them in the future.
All right, thank you. Next, we'll move on to item 6B, discussion of possible action by Human Resource Finance Property Committee to forward to the county board. This is part of our ongoing discussion relative to the 2024 budget, and we will be continuing this discussion into November, right up post public hearing through that. So I would turn to the administrator or Christy to see if you have any updates. I know we've got different proposals that have come in. Supervisor Marshall has one. And we have the discussion. We've sort of kicked the can down the road relative to the social improvement fund.
I don't think there's any update from staff. Happy to answer any questions if you have them relative to any of the projects. I know also on the agenda is the CIP and the potential use of American Rescue Plan Act funds, any balance that is currently remaining. So staff are here to assist. Don't have anything else, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, there's only, on the CIP, there was a final number on the, one of our buildings, so that would just be fully funded by ARPA's amendments in the packet, so.
I would just like to interject a couple of things that are still in play. One is we've had recent discussions with both Frontier and Charter relative to broadband expansion. They are looking at potential projects on the west side of the county serving the LTD broadband Rural Digital Opportunity Fund area where LTD was disqualified. Both Charter and Frontier are putting together proposals. They are looking for partnerships. We don't have any formal proposal from them. We have some project scopes. We have a call with Frontier tomorrow, but there is a potential that between now and the hearing next Tuesday on the 2nd, they will ask for a formal commitment of participation in those. In the past, we've used ARPA dollars to fund those. We can't wait until the budget to commit those because the grant applications are due to the State Public Service Commission on the 7th. So that issue may be revisited at a special HR Finance Committee meeting next Thursday before the county board. The progression would be the broadband task force would take up the recommendations on Monday, make a recommendation, if any, to the infrastructure committee, which meets Thursday of next week, and then present it to this committee on that afternoon, and then we may need to have a resolution expressing our support. I just raise that because the potential ties into the ARPA funds, and Jerry and I have been discussing with them, looking for a little bit more specifics. We got a little bit more clarity today, and we'll expect to get more clarity tomorrow, but it will need to run through the channels. I just alert you to that. The second issue deals with the issue of the two-year campuses. As you know, last week we had, there was an announcement made relative to Washington and Fond du Lac counties relative to the state no longer supporting those. We have requests for funding in our capital improvement program relative to the HVAC unit at that facility. There was a webinar this morning hosted by the Wisconsin Counties Association with legislator involvement, talking about how they would approach other campuses. We still have some issues to decide. We own that campus. We have to figure out what we're going to do. I think that there's we may not have the university as a tenant. I think that the opening comments were, it's not when or if the campuses will close, it's when they will close. One of the things we kicked around this morning was whether or not we might want to take a small amount of money to put into a fund to do a study of what those options might be, how we might move forward. I don't think we've got that developed at this time, but I think given the enrollment of 283 at the campus, we can't be far off on that proverbial chopping block. If we're going to be realistic, I think what we need to do is identify what our options are, who we can partner, what the future of that campus is, what the county's long-term interest is in that facility. And, I just threw out a very arbitrary number of whether or not we want to put $50,000 into a study on where that campus might go, where we may go. But again, this is evolving as we speak and meet. There is legislation that has been recently introduced that will provide a grant program for affected campuses. I think there's a desire to expand that to all campuses, not just Richland Center, Fond du Lac and Washington, but there are opportunities for us to plan for the future versus always reacting like the other communities are doing. Administrator Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that webinar this morning, Chair Robinson, myself, and Chair Gibbs watched that webinar. I don't know if any other members did, but shortly after that, sat down with Chris, and I can't get into the weeds on facilities projects because I don't know all the things in the weeds, but we did ask our lead HVAC professional to really sit down, and in light of that kind of takeaway, the initial takeaway from that presentation about kind of the, I don't want to say dire strait, but the kind of current state of those two-year campuses, really take again a fresh look at that project and what might make the most sense. And I don't know if Chris is in a good position to elaborate, but one of the things we had them look at was looking at the system, and if you had to plan, as Chair Robinson referenced, for potential future use, whether it's redevelopment, divestment, and potential parceling off of those facilities, what might be some things that might influence our project. And one of the things that Chris and the professional looked at was what are the other buildings? How does the central plant serve all of those campus buildings? And I learned one thing, that one of the buildings, the newest building on campus, is actually independently served. And I don't know if that's a good thing, a bad thing, or it's certainly just a fact of interest. But Chris, do you want to talk through kind of what you and Steve kind of were looking into, and how the project, we may have a different recommendation potentially before the budget with respect to that project?
Yeah, so, and obviously when we first looked at the project, we were looking at, kind of things in line with the charge of how do we incorporate more under facilities umbrella? How do we kind of incorporate those pieces under our automated system, with more of a longer term look? With all the newer developments, you're still in a bind, so to speak, with end of life equipment. But then through the conversations this morning, and we had a brief one with a vendor who helped us build the budget for the project, and we're waiting on one other number. But long story short, what the county can do in lieu of the phase project, which would answer the big question mark in terms of how do you still serve the campus, serve those buildings, and avoid risk and liability associated with providing the heat, rather than phasing it over 2 years and having that approximately $825,000 in total. This year, you could essentially do two things. Still replace the burners and the main boilers. And as those are at end of life, obsolete, you can't get parts. So even if they break, you don't really have an option. So you replace those burners, and then you replace the controls, because right now it's more of a hybridized system between automated and pneumatic. So you move it all over to automated or controls in that system, and then you can stop there. So the burner replacements would be roughly $275, which is there as phase one. And then right now, the number we're waiting on is what would it take to just update the controls. So probably in the realm of $320,000 in total, and then that would be it. What that does is it puts the campus and the facilities that plant serves into a position where you've got updated burners. You move away from the fuel oil back up, because right now they're dual fuel. And you have a third boiler, the one from 1967, which has been welded and repaired and bubble gummed and duct taped over time. But in the event of some sort of catastrophic failure, let's say, like the likelihood of one of the two main burners, and they're exceptionally large, they would easily take up half this room. The likelihood of both of them failing is very, very low. So even if one were to fail, you'd still have the one. But worst case scenario, and this gets back to part of what we were going to do to eliminate other boilers on the campus, would be that even if both of those were to fail, you could still limp along with the third boiler, and then there's two additional ones that are similarly at end of life, same era to the one that was in Eastgate Hall. They've been repaired this year, but they weren't running this year because it took forever to get the parts in. So you're in a position where for the planning future, if you needed to buy time for like, what would your plan be in different scenarios? It would give you the time to do that without the worry of providing heat. There's additional pieces to it, to buildings like Marathon Hall, which is currently still turned on. It's still heated, so there's holding costs associated with that building. If now or in the future they're planning, decided like, look, there is no like known use for that based on previous outreach and attempts to make use of it, and just the current situation with, there's a lot of, it's built very sturdy, but there's also a lot to it that make it less conducive to other uses. But what I'm trying to say is that you can cut that building off, and then you would have savings on the holding costs as part of that. And then also through the discussions with UW in the meantime, if it turns out that there are certain buildings that they wouldn't use, then you can kind of walk them back a bit so that you're not necessarily maintaining them at where we would want it to be in this room, but kind of at a minimum. It's still a minimum occupancy threshold because you have to stick to those regulations, but you would be able to walk it back to that while other plans are being decided. So yeah. So if we were to do the phase, I don't know what we would call it, phase D or option D, then it would be just replacing those two things. Obviously, there's pieces of this about the future state for that space that are unknowns, but nevertheless, it would keep the main building and keep all the buildings that it currently serves in play, and eliminate the worries in terms of the system being at end of life.
The other thing I'll add is, and Chris alluded to this idea that it gets us to a place where we can talk with the UW about their plans and their facility needs long term. I just want to let everyone know, I did have a conversation with Chancellor Gibson relatively recently, and that is one of the things they were tasked with. Chair Gibbs and I, in fact, made that request several months ago. You're not at a 1,200 student occupancy anymore, but you have buildings that historically had occupied, that had served to have that many kids or adults, I should say, on campus for education. So what do you really need? And we made that request, and my understanding is President Rothman has made that request as well. So Chancellor Gibson and his staff are working to develop that, for lack of a better phrase, vision for future campus needs, which, as Chris said, this option D, or I'll call it the MacGyver option, will allow us to meet our current needs, our current responsibilities, I should say, under the existing memorandums and leases, while also allowing us, I think, a pretty advantageous position to be in terms of whatever decision they come up with in terms of building needs. We should be able to make it work.
So I have a question of Chris. In the context of investments, if we make the $320,000 investment, are those expenditures, will the improvements made be beneficial to us as we move to if we look for a longer term solution?
I think so, because you're kind of between a rock and a hard place, and only because the equipment that is obsolete. So I think you're at a position where what's the minimal investment to make into that space to maintain it moving forward while these other pieces are coming into play, and not necessarily throwing good money after bad, let's say, like maybe the long-term lens we were looking at it with is moot at this point and should wait for, okay, what are possible future states, whether that's a combination of UW or maybe the county repurposes buildings or uses some of them. The plant being able to be in that sort of improved operational situation gives you the room to do all that, and still there's room to, hypothetically, you could still move away from that central plant at some point in the future to individual buildings.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you. There was a question, or there was an investment of $550,000 in year 2. Does the 320 replace the 550, or is there a second investment in year 2 necessary?
It's a good question, and I should have been more clear. The 325 is one and done. So if we invest 325 in the project now and get that done next year, you're set. Now, could other things be done? Sure. But again, absent the long-term vision and plan, then it wouldn't make sense to start assuming certain things with that. But what this does is it meets that minimum in terms of responsibility, keeps the, eliminates the worries of what if things were to break and you can't get parts because they're, those sorts of things. So yeah, it shrinks it down from a two-phase project to one, and ultimately from the initial proposal was 372 for kind of a reinforcement of the status quo there. So it walks it back from there probably by about 50K, but it really cuts the long-term vision piece if the status quo were to remain by $500,000.
Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Chris, for the diligence and the work that you've done in such a short period of time. I guess the one question that I'd still have is, I think we understood that we were moving the first Plan A, if there was, that two-phased approach moved that boiler system to current standards as far as efficiency in comparison to a 1967 facility that was efficiency that probably now is somewhere around 50%. Does this 320 provide, I'm assuming it provides some efficiencies, but maybe not quite to the extent we would have had the other way. Is that true?
Correct. I think it's minimal efficiency at this point. It doesn't include replacing that small Whirlpool from 67, that boiler. So had that moved forward, that smaller boiler would have been replaced so that then it could run the whole campus during the summer versus the two larger. And so you're going to lose a little bit by having the two larger, but at the same time, you've got those two PK boilers, the Eastgate Hall era ones that were repaired this year. Yeah. You can fall back on those as well, which we couldn't do this year, but if they're in working order, next summer, then you wouldn't run the two big ones, you'd run those two.
Okay. And I think the other thing to add is I think it's a reasonable assumption moving forward that Chancellor Gibson's plan or the vision that we're going to see is going to be a much more consolidated footprint that they're going to need. I mean, I say that not knowing that, but we had 1,200 students. We're down to in that 300 area. I mean, I think that's if the initial plan doesn't have that, I think that's a very fair ask of the county to them to say it is not reasonable for us to maintain the square footage that we have been because the student population is not there. So go back and take another crack at the plan. And I think, again, credit to this meeting wrapped up at about, I forget what time it wrapped up, mid-morning.
11 o'clock.
And the first call I made was to Chris, and he came over and brought Steve. We met at 1 o'clock. So they've accomplished a lot in the couple hours yet this morning. The joys of facility management, I suppose. But I do think the message was one that perhaps we should have, or maybe we did. Certainly I had seen some contraction and a long-term, the two-year campus long-term vision was in question. The meeting today, as Chair Robinson referenced, opened with kind of a pretty stark reality. Now, I don't know what that means for our campus. Maybe we'll be the outlier in that, but regardless of that, I think the plan that we've come up with is a more sound one than saying, hey, let's take it to a place where the Marathon County, we know, is going to be in charge of maintaining those buildings for the next 30 years. Quite honestly, I don't think we can say that. We can do it from an operational perspective with our staff just being more involved in the maintenance. I think that's a vision that Chris and I have talked about. But reducing the cost, I think, makes sense. Bringing that project back to a place where as we start to consolidate the footprint, the load on those that infrastructure is less.
Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a little concerned with leaving the students and the school out of our conversation. I feel like this is a little premature, and if we are going to go ahead and almost scale back our investment, it might encourage fewer students to go when we don't know what UWSP's intentions are. We haven't had those meetings yet. And I was on the call this morning, and it sounded like President Rothman hasn't even weighed in officially with the rest. I mean, there's still plans that he's asked chancellors to make. I hate to not invest if these are still our buildings. And even if we shrink the UWSP's footprint, they're still our buildings, and maybe there's another use for them, the boiler, the heat, anyway.
Yeah, I can
If I
speak
could
to
just
that.
interject, I think we're not, my concern is the students as well, but if we don't plan, you react. And the problem that we have right now is all of the discussions are get the communities or counties that are affected by this together, move forward, but we still have, we have a facility to serve Marathon Hall that isn't there. We've got a field house in Poole. Poole hasn't been used in a while. I think that sooner or later we need to begin to look at what are the options available to the county. Do we need a centralized heating cooling system? Do we look at individual buildings? You've got North Hall, South Hall, you've got the arts, you've got the field house, the Marathon Hall. Fortunately, the WIPS building is separate, but what are our options going forward? I don't think anybody's willing to concede that we don't want higher educational opportunities available there, but I don't think we saw Washington County and Fond du Lac counties closing either.
I just want to address your concern. This is purely from a facilities perspective too, which is I think is what you're speaking to. But I just want to stress that this approach doesn't preclude you from continuing down the line at some point. It's essentially kind of where can you hit the pause button, still have the risk, liability, and responsibilities met, and buy time for the further conversation so that, let's say you needed a bigger or smaller boiler to replace that Whirlpool at some point in the future, then you would know, like, okay, this is what it looks like for UW, this is what it looks like for those buildings. So rather than sort of building into an unknown, you'd have more certainty with what you're putting in, but in the meantime, you're not kind of, you're not investing into that uncertainty. You're saying we can invest, the buildings are good, services are good, everything's essentially the same from a student or UW perspective. Nothing's really changing there. It's just a matter of, okay, what would the next steps be based on information we get back from Chancellor Gibson and everybody else. And so it's same deal long term. Like, it may be prudent to say the central plant should look like this with an additional boiler because of these reasons. Or maybe it's determined that, you'll move in a different direction and say, well, okay, well, rather than having a central plant, we'll decentralize. Now, what do those costs look like? And then why would you do that? So this allows you to really get at the elephant in the room from my point of view, which is just you have an obsolete system that you can't get parts for. So this gets you to a point where you can maintain the heat, keep the campus going for any and all purposes. In my opinion, it really is insulated from the other questions that people are bringing up and other topics. It's more of a fundamental thing that this is getting you to a point where you're able to eliminate the facilities worries and have all the other conversations you need that then backfeed into that facilities conversation at the appropriate time.
Chair Gibbs.
I was just going to say, I think it gives us the safety net to ensure that we're providing or we have facilities that will be heatable in the case of an emergency. If right now, I think what we're hearing from facilities is we don't know because of the age of the equipment and our just recent historic past, the ability to draw and receive parts if that system were to go down. This puts us in a place that guarantees that we can continue to provide the heat for the facilities and the students as we have these other discussions. I don't think it precludes those. It complements it at this point. So
I don't think we're in a position tonight to act on that. I would request that the EEDC meeting or committee at their meeting next week also consider this and have a discussion relative to what our budgetary needs might be, both in terms of the KIP and in terms of potentially a study. And we still have time in which to deal with that within the context of the budget discussion. Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And going forward in these discussions, I'd also like to know what the plan is for the 2 years that are ending operations and the, I believe it was UW Richland, I know it's not called that anymore, but Richland Center, I think, closed their doors this year. And I'd like to know whatever county that is, that what their plan is. And I think Supervisor Lemmer brought up a good point that regardless of what we do, we're still going to own the buildings, regardless of the future of the MC. So I think we have to make this decision diligently and consider that no matter who occupies those buildings, it's still the county's. And if we're looking to divest it and we're making improvements on it, that could raise the value of that building too, rather than having a building with a heating system that doesn't work. So all those things I think need to be explored going forward. Thank you.
All right, I think we've kicked that non-motioned issue around. Supervisor Marshall, I'm going to call on you. You had a proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the resolution that I had put in the packet was in relation to the buildings that we are vacating. Let me see if I can find it. And what we do with the proceeds from those buildings. There it is. The intent, I understand, was that when we moved to North Central Healthcare, which just the 3 items that I could pick out of the budget will be a total of $4.3 million between the renovations of the existing space, moving of the critical IT hub, and the new signage. We will be vacating, from what I understand, several buildings. And the question is, those buildings that we're vacating, we're making an investment to make the move. We could take the sale of those buildings to go against the debt service. And that doesn't mean that the debt service has to be paid off all in 1 year, but it could be in the debt service fund to make the tax rate more even, as well as make up for the bond payments that we're being responsible for. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, first off, I want to thank Supervisor Marshall for bringing this forward. I think one of the, because I think it gets to something that I had alluded to before, and that was, what are we going to do? And I think that's part of the presentation that we had from the consultants earlier, is how do we sit there and structure potentially so that we can insulate the taxpayers from a rate shift, significant rate shift, tax rate shift, year after year, if, one, we don't have a net new construction or a net increase in valuation that we've had over the last 2 years of 11%. On top of that, a net new construction of the last 2 years, 1.7 and 2.3. And putting some dollars aside for insulating that debt service, because the unknown, we've put a tremendous requirement on a county entity, NCHC, to be able to provide the coverage of that debt and cover the debt service that they're saying that they're hoping to be able to achieve. With that being said, I think there's still some question. So I appreciate. The one thing I guess I would ask is, there's always different options available, and what is the, because we haven't had that discussion yet on the board as far as divestment. Is the sale the appropriate vehicle to utilize at this point, or is there a potential of a different use of that property for rental? Is there a different use of that property that may be redevelopment and lease of the land? I don't know that we've had those discussions yet. I would like to at least have some kind of understanding because whenever you go to sale, you get to, as one of my old investment brokers told me, you get to sell property one time in your lifetime, and you've got the proceeds once. However, if you have different options of, I don't know that we've ferreted those out yet. I like the idea of setting that up and setting that aside for debt service or possibly capital or whatever that may be. And so I really appreciate the supervisors bringing that forward. But I would like to go into and get to the chair's discussion one time was, what's our divestment policy on multiple properties that we may have? So I appreciate the offer that was brought forward.
Just as an aside, I had a conversation with Corp Counsel Pruner a few days before your budget amendment came in. I had asked him to pull together all of the current county policies and ordinances and statutory requirements relative to disposition of the sale. And I think this is an item that was on our work plan, and we just haven't gotten to it, but I would like to get to that as soon as possible. I think there's merit in considering putting that into a debt service and or capital fund going forward. And I think we have some time, but I understand your desire to try to tie it into the expenditures. So the question is, do we, can we develop a policy? Because we have potentially multiple facilities across this community. There's a lot on the other side of the research station. There are, properties all over. There are small parcels, remnant parcels. There are other parcels that we haven't acquired through tax deed. How do we deal with them, and where does that money go? I think it's a worthwhile discussion. Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that I think this would set a precedent is being a landlord of an entire building. We are landlords of multiple small spaces within the courthouse, but for the county to say, I want to now become a landlord, would be not status quo, but would be a new adventure. My feeling is that we should keep the main thing, and do things that enhance the county and leave being a landlord to someone that is in the business.
I am looking out the window and I'm seeing properties there where we have been the landlord or are the landlord. So we do have that precedent. Whether
right,
it's,
because that was a strategic property in the strategic plan. These are properties we're vacating them because they're not strategic. Thank you.
Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, too, we need to be thinking about, we may be landlords with UWMC property. If the UWSP shrinks their footprint, we will still own other buildings, for instance, the field house, the dorms, one of the halls, whatever. And so I think it does, I love the idea of having this, but I think an overarching policy first before we create a resolution on how to spend money might be helpful, so we're not pigeonholing ourselves and requiring us to sell everything when maybe it isn't necessarily in our best interest or even possible to sell all of the properties that we have.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, I think the other thing, and again, I think we haven't developed policy yet, because I think what we heard from PFM is there's time to understand debt management and reserves and investments and how those all interplay. And I liken that to if I'm receiving interest on a savings account at 3% and I'm paying 1.5%, even though I'm paying interest at less. We haven't developed that part of the policy yet either, and so I would love to be able to, at least spell out that if our interest rate that we're receiving on our investments is above what our debt service interest rate is, that we at least manage that as long as we're managing our reserves within our reserve policy and managing that in light of our debt management policy. Does it? So I think we need to have a comprehensive look at the proposal along with a long-term plan to understand how they all interplay with each other.
Supervisor Baker.
Thank you. I support this resolution.
You're on mute, Supervisor Baker.
We're having a,
Well,
there.
that's it. Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Sorry.
Okay. I was unmuted on my end, but it's managed mute, so that's not up to me. So I was saying that I support this resolution, and I think this would be a good use of the funds from the building. It's all ties in with the development and the move. But one point I would like to make is we have a TIP task force going on, and that is basically one of the objections or discussion items for that is that there is property that's not providing tax revenue to other municipalities and entities like the school system and North Central Healthcare and the city. So if we own buildings and lease them out, I'm not 100% sure of this, so that's partially a question, but it would seem to me that we would not be providing those taxes to the Wausau school system, the city of Wausau, and North Central Healthcare. And that seems to be relatively analogous to the issues that we, are discussing relative to other people doing that. And then we'd be competing with private industry, private landlords. When we have tax exempt status, our income is, not taxed. So it doesn't seem to me like a good idea to get into the business of leasing buildings and, being a property manager. I don't have any objection to the 3 buildings that we purchased next to the courthouse because, as Supervisor Marshall said, those were strategic purchases, and that I supported that. I voted for that. Thank you.
All right, any other questions or discussion? Questions? If not, is there a motion? Supervisor Hart.
I just wanted a point of clarification. So is this this is an amendment for the 2024 budget, correct? Okay.
So just a question for my own gratification, because we're moving from a budget document into policies in there. And Mike, I know that you drafted this. Can you just elaborate on the appropriateness of amendments like this and effectiveness?
Sure. So it is a policy document, and my understanding of the intent would be that it would be a policy adopted as part of the budget. So although it doesn't necessarily impact or amend any of the budgetary appropriations, it sets forth, I guess, guidelines for those appropriations. I don't see any prohibitions to doing that, so I think it's okay to do.
Chair Gibbs.
I guess so. My question would be to Corp Counsel. and I believe it says it would require, as it reads currently, it would require the sale proceeds to be used to be sold at the highest bid. This board can't bind another board to a potential sale, can it? I mean, then the question becomes, can this board, if it's not part of the budget, well, it's part of the budget, but I think it potentially, the sale could take place in another, a totally different calendar year than the budget year, or potentially into another board's term. Can we effectively require that?
It's a good question. And it's one that I actually was thinking about a few minutes ago, about binding a future board. I think that potentially could depend on when the sale occurs. You know, if it occurs during the term of this board, then that's not an issue. If it occurs after April, then potentially that's an issue. What I believe this resolution, or what this policy document would require, would be it's basically approving the administration's current plan of moving forward with the consolidation to the North Central Healthcare Campus, and then once that occurs, the sale would need to result. It doesn't necessarily specify when the sale would occur. I guess I don't have a good answer for you. I can see the concern about binding a future board because of the sold to the highest bidder term. I think generally saying the more general directives, I think, aren't as problematic as that specific part. I honestly hadn't thought of that. So I don't have a good answer for you.
Chair Gibbs.
I think that in its, well, in my opinion, that begs the question, what's the policy that we're going to develop if we're going to develop a policy long-term on the divestment of property and the management of debt? I think that we don't, as I understand it, we don't have, other than our CIP rollover policy, we don't have a long-term policy on debt management or property tax levy management, if I'll call it something, and a divestment policy. So I would offer that developing that policy is the critical point that then allows us to apply the policy to future boards. Because then the policy's there, and unless the policy's changed, then the policy is being followed by the board. It sets us up for success in what we just heard from our consultants from PFA for bonding issues, for long-term stability issues. I think that the development of that policy or those policies sets us up for long-term success rather than dealing with each particular set of facts and circumstances on a separate issue. I really liken the idea that when we look back at our CIP policy, that has served the county very well for the length of the time that the CIP policy has been in place. We look back to it. How does a CIP rollover happen? We can get into the discussion about the social improvement fund and how it didn't happen when it should have. But that being set aside, I think what we've seen historically is the CIP policy has developed, and our bonding policy and our borrowing policies has helped provide the tax rate and the bonding rating that we receive from our rating agencies in the positive light that it is being viewed at, and it results in the interest rates that we have seen on the borrowings that we have had. So I would still encourage this board to develop those policies so that the policies can be implemented, and then it's generic to whatever disposition of property is, whether it be the disposition of these properties on River Drive, whether it be the disposition of tax deeded properties and the like. So I would like to have those developed so that we understand the total impacts of all of it on long term.
Supervisor Marshall, and then Supervisor Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that we've been said that the county is a business and the citizens of Marathon County are our customers. No business I know makes an investment of $4.3 million to buy a new campus, renovate a new campus, to move to that new campus without having an idea of what they're planning to do with their property they're moving out of. So my other suggestion is I would be happy to make a motion that we remove those 3 items from the budget, and that until we have a plan for our divestment, then at that time we can approve them separately, since I believe they're all ARPA funds. That is my motion.
Is there a second? Is there a second? Is there a second? That motion dies for lack of a second. I'm sure we'll revisit that. Let me just make an observation and a commitment from the chair, is that I think we need policy relative to divestment. We need to look at, what criteria do we use? Do we go with a high bidder, or is there an ability to work with another interested local government? I think those things need to be spelled out. What criteria do we apply for those in advance of the request? And what do we do with the proceeds from those? And I would like to try to see us resolve that policy by the middle of February, so that this board can consider it and adopt it for going forward. I think that's a long overdue issue. We've got a number of facilities and properties that are excess. We need a policy in place and criteria in place to do it. So I make that commitment to try to get that done. And Mike, we would look to you to try to pull together that background. What's current, what's allowable, and where do we go from here? So I hear exactly what you're saying. I appreciate those concerns, and I think we need to get our arms around that bigger issue. Supervisor Baker.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So a couple comments. One is, I think this is a policy regarding this divestment of our buildings. I know it's not a comprehensive policy for all of our buildings. I think that will be, a long-term, maybe like you suggest, like Chair Robinson just suggested, maybe 6 months. But the other point that I want to make is, it seems a little bit, it's hard for me to understand how it is okay for a previous board to commit this board to paying for $68 million in debt, which I want to be very clear, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't pay for it. No one has suggested that it is our obligation, we need to pay for it. But that was a commitment that a previous board has made. The policy for using CIP rollover, that's a commitment that's a commitment that a previous board has made that may not be binding on us, but we treat it as binding on us. We're talking about discussing changing it. We can adopt this policy that Supervisor Marshall has proposed if a future board wants to take it up and change the policy, that's, probably their right. That doesn't mean that we can't adopt it as a guiding principle and, as part of our plan. And, if that gets changed in the future, so be it. But that's not a reason not to consider it. Thank you.
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at this, I think this is a really good basis for a discussion for us. One of the things I hesitate is to make this part of the budget. I read this as this is making the board divest in these properties in this year when I'm not even sure if we're on the timeline to do that. And I think the word pigeonhole was used before. I don't want to pigeonhole us into options that might not be viable into the future. So I would be, I would like to use this as the basis for that discussion, which I hope happens in the very near future. I know you, and maybe this is, making a request of the chair that we have this discussion as to how we divest properties into the future. But I don't like putting this into the budget because I think this makes a commitment that I think could cause troubles in the future. Thank you.
All right, Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make, I think, 2 points. One would be, I think the sale of those properties, if they were separately sold, would, I believe, need a separate approval by the county board. So in that way, I don't think this resolution binds a future board because the terms of whatever future sale would have to be approved by the board. And that's really where I come down on whether this particular policy binds a future board. I would think I would come down on the side that it doesn't because it's a policy statement that is similar to other policies that the board can and has generated. And maybe there could be some tweaking of language as far as the terms of the sale so that it's not as specifically binding, but that's my legal analysis at this point, but certainly I respect the committee's discussion, and if the committee wants to discuss further, that's fine with me too.
All right, are there any other issues? I know that we had kicked the can down the road relative to the use of the social improvement fund in the application of the fund balance toward the budget. And I know Supervisor Baker is on the phone. Any discussion relative to that item? Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. So we had a social services board meeting where this was asked because we went over their budget. And one of, and let me say that they understand that this is moving from the social improvement fund to the CIP balance. I think one of the things within all of this is, and this is just a larger discussion, I'm not making a motion or anything like that, but I would be more acceptable to this if this were taking from the transfer to the fund balance, then, because as I understood it at social services, they're making a transfer from the social improvement fund to fund balance, and then this 1.5 million to debt service. But then within all of that, I have larger concerns about the long-term ramifications of borrowing from our savings to pay debt. I just think that's a really bad precedence to be setting us up into the future. So I just wanted to put that out there as we bring this discussion up.
Christy.
Just it's a function of being able, so the funding is sitting in fund balance. So it's a balance sheet account. In order to bring it into the budget, you need to run it through an income statement. So we're taking it transfer into the social improvement fund So it's revenue coming back into there, and then you're moving it to debt service. That's really just the function of bringing it back in so it can be reflected in the activity of the year.
I just would like to make a comment. I am concerned about the amount of the restricted fund balance that went into the social improvement. I think we'll now take measures to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But my concern is that we are applying a significant amount of ARPA funds to this year's capital improvement plan. We are budgeting tighter and tighter relative to department budgets, and we are therefore reducing the end of the year balance, which becomes our fund balance that the excess goes into the capital improvement fund. I fully support reconciliation of what is the appropriate level in the social improvement fund, but I would strongly encourage the board to consider rolling that into allowing that to lapse into the fund balance for the purposes of establishing the KIP for 2025 in that budget, which would be consistent with past practices. I appreciate Supervisor Baker bringing this to the attention of the board, but I think we've got some critical needs going forward. Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you reference the chart on, I believe, page 54 of the packet, it shows that the balance was hovering just shy of $4 million and is now at $14 million. I believe the supervisor is only suggesting we use 1.5 of that $14 million. It does not appear to be a significant amount that would preclude us from using a significant amount for capital improvement in the future. And when you delay tax relief to people, I believe that that's a disservice to our citizens. This is money that has built up, again, going from less than 4 million to 14 million. And it is a significant amount of money that is in reserve. And we're only asking to use $1.5 million, and I support Dave Baker's resolution. Thank you.
Chair Gibbs.
There's no question that the social improvement fund went from the numbers hovering around $4 million to now roughly $14 million. We've also had a discussion around how much of that, and the finance department laid out that there's 3 types of revenue inside that fund that show up on our balance sheet as restricted. It's federal funds, it's state funds, and it's tax levy. Not all of that 14 million is available to roll over because some of it still retains its restricted characteristic. So the thing that, again, we haven't had the long-term discussion because I believe that roughly 6 million is what is transferable into CIP, or roughly thereabouts, as I recall, that the finance department has and the social services department has calculated that is not restricted. 6 million, not the 14. And so then moving that forward and looking at the current year's financials in our CIP project list, we're using in excess of $10 million of ARPA funding that we had rollover of a little over 2 million, almost 3 million, 2.8 million if I remember correctly, that rolled into the CIP, along with 10 million of ARPA is what is used on our CIP project for, at least at the current plan level. And so as looking at, as the chair has mentioned, am a little concerned about, and we have given direction to administration that we are not going to borrow because of our debt load, and I totally support that. But I am concerned that we shortchange the ability to deliver on the rolling stock and the necessary capital needs that the county has potentially for 2025 by using an additional 1.5 million to cover debt and not have looked at, again, a long-term strategy to manage the debt and the tax levy and the CIP all interact with each other and how we manage that long-term.
Supervisor Baker.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I want to ask that the finance director provide us with an update of where the fund balance is as of today, because when I look at the financial reporting, I believe that the fund balance is probably closer to 17 million now. I believe it looks like it's projected to go up another 3 million this year. And I'm not going to, say that that's absolute. That's why I'm asking for an update. And when I discussed this at Health, I'm not asking for that today, but if you can check that out and let us know. When I proposed this at Health and Human Services, I made the point that actually I don't believe that we are actually using fund balance for this because we've been going up $3 million a year. So really what I believe we are doing, and I know this is projection in the future, but we have quite a large balance if the projection's off. What I believe what we're really doing is slowing down the rate of growth of that fund balance, taking $1.5 million of that we're setting aside out of that 3 million and using it for keeping our tax levy low. So, I think it's not actually necessarily taking any money out of that fund balance, just not adding to it. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Any motions? Supervisor Marshall.
I make a motion to accept the resolution to take $1.5 million of social services or social improvement fund to offset as a transfer to the debt for the 2024 budget as in amendment number 1.
Is there a second? Is there a second? Is there a second? That motion dies for lack of a second. I would imagine we'll see that one again as well. Any other motions or items before us? And again, we will continue to discuss this based upon feedback during the public hearing. And we have the committee meeting the day before the county board meeting on the 8th. Well, our meeting's on the 8th, the county board meeting's on the 9th. I think any items are still fair game. Any other items come before us? We're looking for input from EEDC relative to the university. We may have some issues relative to broadband, depending upon how those discussions go, but we also may have to deal with that separately. We may have to have, again, that special meeting before the county board meeting next week. All right. Then we will move on to anything else relative to the budget or the KIP at this time. Then we'll move on to 7B. Administrator Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize. I don't have quite the fancy presentation that Kristen had from PFM. Really just a brief update. So as Christy alluded to with North Central Healthcare as a discretely comprised component unit or discretely recognized component unit. Sorry, it's late in the day. North Central Healthcare has certain abilities or lacks certain abilities, and one of them not only under current law is the inability to borrow, but also under our tri-county agreement, they don't have the ability to own property. So I'm going to go back a little bit of a history lesson here and give you an update on what I am doing to, I think, rectify either the loss of a past lease or the fact that a lease never occurred. But North Central Healthcare, as you know, delivers a wide variety of services for Marathon County, Lincoln County, and Langlade County. One of the services for Marathon County is the delivery of what we refer to as community-based residential facility bed space. Back in 1993 and 1994, North Central Healthcare effectively bought with county funding some property to use for that very specific purpose. Again, under the tri-county agreement that existed at that time, North Central Healthcare wasn't able to effectively own property. So in 1997, those properties that were purchased by North Central were transferred to the county, and the county, through the agreement for purposes of purchasing those, the warranty deeds, there was supposed to be a payment from North Central equal to the cost that the county effectively bought those properties back through the form of rent. Similarly, there was envisioned a lease to be executed between North Central Healthcare and the county. I should say actually between the county as the owner of those properties and North Central as the lessee. So the deeds were recorded in 1999, so those properties were transferred to Marathon County's ownership in 1999. North Central did in fact pay back Gary and his team were able to find records of paying back the cost of those properties. However, what is not available to be found is the corresponding lease between North Central Healthcare, between the county as the owner of the property and North Central Healthcare to occupy them and to do so for purposes of delivering community-based residential facility bed space within Marathon County. So I'm just giving you an update. I am going to rectify that lack of a lease. Gary and I are going to execute that lease later in the very near future, and I just want to give you a very high-level overview of what that lease is going to entail. As was referenced in the meeting earlier with Wisconsin Counties Association and the UW, they said the leases from the 1960s were vague and exceedingly short. I can assure you we will do our best to not have exceedingly short or a vague lease. It will be a very specific lease because, again, the county owns those properties. They are off the tax roll. We own them. We have owned them for the very specific purpose of having North Central deliver, either directly or indirectly, those services. So that will be a key component of those leases. We will also lay out, and we've already got these documents largely completed, but clear responsibility relative to maintenance and other expenses. My goal, of course, is limiting the county's exposure relative to maintenance and insurance, ensuring that the buildings are insured by the county, because that is our interest. All of the components within them will be the responsibility of North Central Healthcare. I will be very transparent with you. The goal and how we came to realize this is North Central has been working to effectively identify other entities, either private or nonprofit entities that deliver the same sort of services, to do so in public-private partnership to maintain quality and decrease cost ultimately to the county. They've identified that partnership and are moving forward in that direction to ensure that, again, the CBRF services continue to be delivered, but would be delivered through that partnership as opposed to directly through North Central Healthcare. Of course, in trying to get all the agreements in place to allow that to happen, that's when they realized that these leases didn't exist. But just wanted to let you know that we'll be signing those either later this week or early next week, but effectively we're just entering into the agreements that should have been entered into probably when Mike was in middle school. Is that right? Yeah. So happy to answer any questions, and Gary and Jason are here to give you any background, but it's not nearly as exciting as a debt management policy.
Are there any questions for our illustrious guests? So were they vague or non-existent agreements?
We have information and belief. I would venture a guess that they were never executed, but either way, whether they were never executed or are unable to be located, we're going to rectify the issue.
All right, any questions for Administrator Leonard or representatives from North Central Healthcare? We appreciate the diligence on rectifying our past to move forward. All right, thank you. Are there any items that you'd like to see us bring up in future discussion? And again, we need to work on that surplus property policy, not just for social services, but for all of our property. And we will begin to look at that. And we still have budget for the next meeting. Other items for future meetings? I know you continue to have interest in healthcare and where we're going. Supervisor Marshall? And healthcare costs?
I believe that Molly is working on doing a few of those items, so unless Lance had any other updates.
No, I'm partway through the book that Supervisor Marshall dropped off, so I don't have any substantive updates right now.
But we will schedule that on a regular basis for educational presentations, and if there are policy issues surrounding it, for action. Other items? If not, we are down to item 9. Moved by Supervisor Marshall, seconded by Chair Gibbs to adjourn. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries.